Freedom is really what this passage is all about. Everybody, I think, wants to be free. Everybody, I think, wants to enjoy freedom. And we all have our ideas about what freedom is. I think generally the idea or the definition that we would give to freedom is that of being unrestrained. That of being free to choose what I want to do. That's what we would probably define freedom as. But is that really freedom? As I thought about freedom, there are lots of things that seem to promise to make us free. As I was sitting this week and thinking about freedom, for some reason I couldn't stop thinking about car adverts. You know, car adverts, there's always like this new shiny car, and the guy who's driving always looks really happy. There's usually a big open road before him, and the wheels are doing that kind of spinning backwards thing, even though the car's going forwards. And the kind of feel that you get from the advert, it's not a explicit thing, it's something that's kind of hidden, covert, but the feeling you get is this car will make you free. If you have this car, you could go anywhere. It's an open road before you. The world's your oyster. You could do what you want. And yet, we know, don't we? A new car won't make you free. It will get stuck in traffic just like the old car. You will get up to go to work and you won't find a big open road before you. You'll just be stuck at the traffic lights and then behind that big row of traffic. And what you will find actually is the new car doesn't make you free, but it might even make you its slave. It's a bit of a silly illustration, but it might make you its slave. Suddenly, Saturday mornings are no longer yours. You've got to get up and wash the car. You've just spent thousands of pounds on this thing, and now your Saturday mornings are taken with washing it. And then maybe a few months down the line, someone's taken your car out for a drive, and there's a big V down the side of it because there was a gate post that somebody didn't see. And now this car that was meant to set you free is suddenly emptying your bank account. It's making you its slave. And like I said, that's a silly illustration, but there's lots of things like that in life that promise freedom. If you just get me, everything will be okay. If you just do life this way, everything will be great. And everyone's searching for freedom. We saw last time in Galatians, and the first part of chapter 4, that actually the whole of humanity is enslaved to these, what Paul calls elementary principles. And we saw that is because of the fall. We are all searching to try and get free, but whenever we turn somewhere, we get enslaved. So in times past and in other countries at present, people turn to kind of pagan idolatry. If you worship the elements or your ancestors, or you carve an idol and worship that, the hope is that by offering the sacrifices and giving the worship, somehow your life will be better. You will get prosperity. And we also thought last time about how we are to kind of civilize for that kind of idolatry, but we have all sorts of other idols that promise that if we just pay our money and do our time at the desk, we will then be free. But actually, all of those, they're just empty promises. And in fact, they only lead to more slavery. And the lie that the Galatians are swallowing at the minute is the idea that the law could bring them freedom. That by following some Jewish dietary rules and being circumcised and some special feasts and festivals, if they do that, they will be free. That they will become part of God's family and enjoy His freedom. That's what this whole book is about. And last time in chapter 4, Paul was saying, no, you were slaves in the past. Now because of Jesus, you are sons of God. Enjoy that freedom. And the problem is, for all of us, even as Christians, there's a temptation to even now go looking elsewhere for freedom. As I was thinking about this word freedom, how do we buy into other ideas of freedom or other things that would offer us freedom? I was thinking about technology. We think technology will be able to fix everything. If we only get the right piece of technology, life would be easier. And yet, I find again the technology that promises you much freedom actually just makes you its slave. Yeah, it's great. There's nothing wrong with technology, but if you look to technology to make you free, you'll find that you are its slave. You'll be constantly buying the next gadget, constantly updating that software. And we have a whole load of people who now are enslaved to a smartphone. That's what they do. They spend probably hours and hours a day looking at the screen, thinking somehow that will bring them freedom. Paul's this passage here, Paul is pleading with these Galatians to live in the freedom that they have in Jesus. He says, don't go looking elsewhere for freedom. And that's really the message for us tonight. Don't go looking elsewhere for freedom. We have freedom in Jesus. So our passage is kind of bookended with these two verses. The first one is verse 12. Brothers, I entreat you, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. Become as I am, for I also have become as you are. This is a plea from Paul. It's not a gentle bit of advice. It's a plea. He's pleading with them. There's lots of emotion running through this chapter. He says, become as I am. Paul's setting himself up as this example. And I think the example he wants them to follow is the description that he uses of his own testimony. In 2 verse 20, can you remember, Paul describes how he lives his life. Paul's testimony in 1 verse, 2 verse 20, chapter 2 verse 20, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Paul says, become as I am. Stop going back to the law and just live by faith in Jesus. Just live trusting in Jesus. You remember those words from Luther that I've said more than once. Luther wanted this one idea to reign in his heart. He says, faith in my dear Lord Christ, the beginning, the middle, and end of whatever divine thought I might have by day or by night. Paul wants to live and breathe that air. Faith in Jesus. His life is no longer about self-salvation. His life is no longer about him trying to find freedom. His life is just about trusting in Jesus Christ. And then at the end of our passage, we have this well-known verse, 5 verse 1. For freedom, Christ has set us free. For freedom, Christ has set us free. It says, therefore, do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. We don't have to look elsewhere. We all know what a yoke is. It's the thing that the ox pull, the wood that goes around the neck, and they pull that great burden behind them. Paul goes, don't go putting your head back in the yoke of slavery. Just stand firm in the freedom that you have in Jesus Christ. Christ has rescued you, he said, from this present evil age. He's redeemed you from under the curse of the law. He has given you an inheritance in the promises of God. And one day that will be fully realized. You are free now. One day the full extent of that freedom will be yours. It's don't go anywhere else. Broadly speaking, this passage falls into two halves, verses 12 through to 20, and then 21 to 31. So 12 to 20, if anyone's taking notes, I put here 12 to 20 is all about freedom is found in receiving the apostles' gospel. Freedom's found in receiving the apostles' gospel, and that gospel leads to Christ-likeness. Freedom's found in receiving the apostles' gospel. That gospel leads to Christ-likeness, and the call is to stand firm. In verses 13 to 14, Paul recaps what sounds to me to be like a honeymoon period. He recaps this love that was between the apostle and these people in Galatia when he first met them. Paul had gone in with this gospel, the gospel that's all about Jesus Christ. He'd gone to Galatia with the message of Jesus crucified, and he'd been received like an angel. They'd received him as though he was Jesus Christ himself. And Paul says it wasn't really his plan to go to Galatia preaching. It seems like maybe he was passing through Galatia and then he got sick and had to stay there. We were reminded this morning, weren't we, by Alan, about the sovereignty of God. We have our plans, but God works out his purposes, and it wasn't Paul's plan to preach in Galatia, but it was God's plan that Paul preached in Galatia. Paul didn't go looking for his sickness, but he got sick, and that just, again, a reminder for us, even when trials and problems come our way, God is sovereign over those and he works out his purposes. And through Paul getting sick and having to stop in Galatia, this church is planted. I don't know what was wrong with him. He says something about his eyes there. He says, you would have even plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. That's the affection that was between these Galatian believers and the apostle. I was speaking with a pastor recently who's retired, and I was explaining our situation here, and I was asking him, do you have any pearls? Do you have any advice for me? And he said this, I'm not sure what it means. He said, make sure the honeymoon period lasts as long as possible. Make sure the honeymoon period lasts as long as possible. I'm not sure how you go about that. But Paul's honeymoon period didn't last very long with these Galatian believers. Quickly, it seems, after not very long, these Galatian believers turned away from him. Why was that? It's because there were some new men in town. These false teachers from Jerusalem had come on down to Galatia, and they were spreading this other gospel. This kind of Jesus plus gospel that we've looked at through the book. Yes, Jesus, he's great, trust him, but you've also got to do these other works of the law if you're really going to be inside, if you're really going to be part of God's family. And Paul's contrasting his ministry with the ministry of these false teachers. Paul was a messenger, as we saw early in chapter 1. He was sent from Christ with a message of good news about Christ, and that brings men into freedom. Paul's sent from Christ with a message about Christ that leads to freedom. These false brothers, these false teachers, Paul calls the circumcision party or the Judaizers, they come with a man-made message that is all about man, and it just leads to slavery. So we've got the apostle with a message from Christ about Christ that leads to freedom, and these false teachers that come with a man-made message about man and man's effort and what man can do, and that just leads to slavery. They came with a message, you can do it, guys. If you just try real hard, God will accept you and you'll be in. They made the Galatians feel great. They made much of them. Yeah, of course you can do it. You can live a better life. You can be God's children if you just do this, this and this. See, the gospel at its root cuts away our pride. It tells us we can do nothing, and we don't like that. This new message didn't cut away at pride, but it kind of caused pride to grow. Yeah, you can do it. You can do it. They were kind of flattering these Galatian believers. But they were only flattering them so that they would kind of come and be part of their gang. These false teachers, they just wanted a platform. They wanted a following. They wanted people to be, they wanted to make much of people, but Paul says, so that they would make much of them. They flattered the Galatians so that the Galatians would flatter them. They wanted lots of Twitter followers. They wanted a platform in which to spread their opinions from. And essentially they are leading these people again into slavery. As I thought about these false teachers, I was reminded of what Jesus said to the Pharisees. In Matthew 23, Jesus says this to the Pharisees, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are." These Pharisees were traveling around with their legalistic message and trying to get people to come and follow their teaching and be part of their gang. And Jesus says to them, woe to you. Yeah, you're getting followers, you're making converts, but they're not converts to the kingdom of God, they're your converts. They're converts to you. and ultimately converts to hell. And that's exactly the same thing that's happening here in Galatia. Paul isn't having a go at zeal or making much of people. But Paul says, when you make much of people, it should be for a good purpose. So verse 17, they make much of you, but for no good purpose. Their purpose is that they want to shut you out, he says. But Paul points to his good purpose. Paul describes himself as a brave man, isn't he, using labour pains as an illustration when he's never experienced them himself. He's a brave man, but he describes his ministry as like labour pains. And his purpose of his ministry, he says, is that Jesus Christ may be formed in the hearts and lives of these believers. That's the good purpose that Paul is on about. And that reminds us, doesn't it, of what we're to be all about here at Capernwray. In a way, it's a little bit of a corrective for the way we think about church. In all that we do, teaching of the Sunday school, the holiday club, the Bible study, the prayer meetings, the coming to church, the purpose of it all is that Jesus Christ would be formed in each one of us. That's why we do what we do, and that people will come in and be saved, and Jesus Christ will be formed in them as well. The work of the church is not just to get people to attend. It's not just to get people in this building and to sit on the seats. It's not to be a club for people to socialise. It's not to call people to a lifestyle where we all just live clean lives and pat each other on the back. That's not the role of the church. The role of the church is that Jesus Christ would be formed in each one of us. So that's the corrective from these verses. There's also a little bit of a warning. This Galatian church wasn't planted many years before, and yet already they were going astray. The church has been planted by the Apostle Paul. There's probably not a more successful, if we use that word, church planter in the history of the church. And yet, after not many years, they are going astray. There's a warning for us. We are all susceptible to false teachers that would draw us away from the centre ground of the gospel. There's all sorts of people teaching all sorts of things out there. And now, more than ever, we have access to so many of them in books, podcasts, different sermons, all sorts of things that we can access. And the warning to us is not to be diverted. You go on the Christian TV channels and there's men with slick hairstyles and sharp suits and shiny white teeth, and they tell you a gospel that makes you feel great about yourselves, that tell you you can do it, you can live a better life. And it's just not the gospel of the apostles. And so the question as we read books, as we listen to sermons, are these people telling me the gospel that is passed on to us by the apostles? Or are they telling me something else? If they're telling me something else, we just resist it. We stand firm. Anything else apart from the gospel of Jesus Christ will lead you to slavery, no matter what it seems to promise. And as I looked at these verses, 12 to 20, about the freedom that's found in the gospel of the apostles that leads to Christ-likeness, I also thought there's some instruction for us. You and me are starting out on new paths, and I think there's instruction here for the relationship between pastor and people, or elders and people, under shepherds and congregation. Now there's a little bit of a difference in that elders and preachers and pastors are not apostles. Apostles are unique. They receive God's revelation. But the role of a preacher or a pastor is to take the gospel of the apostles and teach that to the church. And I've been reminded as I've looked at this passage this week that we must stand firm on the centre ground of the gospel. The role of the pastor isn't to try to please everyone. It's certainly not to flatter anyone. It's not to entertain people or try and justify himself or make himself look good. The aim of pastoral ministry is that Christ would be formed in people. A quote from Calvin, he wrote, "If ministers wish to do any good, let them labour to form Christ, not themselves, in their hearers." Let them labour to form Christ, not themselves in their hearers. And the scary thing for me is that Paul describes that as like childbirth. He labours that Christ would be formed in people. There's also some instruction for the attitude of people to pastor. People's attitude should not be determined just by external factors. Paul had a lot of things going against him when he was in Galatia. He was a burden. He was sick. Other people were treating him with contempt. If these Galatians had decided their attitude to him on external factors, they would have just rejected him. A pastor shouldn't be judged by his mannerisms or his voice, thankfully, whether he's entertaining or not. The attitude of a congregation shouldn't be taken by theological hair-splitting and focus on secondary and tertiary issues. A congregation's attitude should be determined by the pastor's loyalty to the gospel of the apostles. If the pastor preaches and teaches the gospel of the apostles, he should be received not because of his own merits, but because of the merits of the message. I found again a helpful quote from John Stott. I always find John Stott helpful. He seems to write quite clearly on lots of issues. He writes this: "What should matter to the people is not the pastor's appearance, but whether Christ is speaking through him. What should matter to the people what should matter to the pastor is not the people's favour, but whether Christ is formed in them. The church needs people who, in listening to their pastor, listen to the message of Christ, and pastors who, in labouring among the people, look for the image of Christ." So that's the first point. Freedom is found in receiving the apostles' gospel that leads to Christ-likeness. So we should stand firm in that as a church. The second point is that freedom is found in the powerful promises of man, the powerful promises of God, not man's initiative or effort. Freedom's found in the powerful promises of God, not man's initiative or effort. So these are these verses all about Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael and Isaac. Verse 21 says, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law?" But the type of person Paul has in view here is the religious, proud person. The person who looks at the law and says, "I can do that, I'm up to it, count me in." That's the type of person Paul has in view, someone who's proud of their achievements. Paul doesn't have in view someone who, having received Jesus and trusted him out of love, wants to obey the law. That's a totally different type of person. We were reminded again of that this morning by Alan, that the obedience that is driven by love, that should be true of every Christian. What Paul has in view here is somebody who is under the law, who's relying on the law for their acceptance with God. And he says to these people, "Have you not read the law?" And then he gives us a potted history from the book of Genesis. It's the story of Abraham and his two sons. You'll know the story. Abraham has the promise from God. God says to Abraham, "I'm going to make you a great nation. Your descendants are going to be like the stars of the sky, like the sand of the sea." And the years go by and Abraham's getting older and older and older and nothing is happening. He's getting into his 6th decade, his 7th decade, his 8th decade, and nothing seems to be happening. And so Abraham thinks to himself, "I got this promise from God about being a great nation. Maybe he wants me to do something about it. yes, God's made the promise, but maybe I should do something about it. And he speaks with Sarah, and Sarah says, I'm not going to have any children. You have my servant, my slave woman, Hagar. Abraham goes and sleeps with Hagar, and they have a child, Ishmael. Ishmael is a child, we are told, who's born according to the flesh. He's born according to the normal way, a man and a woman's own ability. That's Ishmael. But that was never God's plan. God was going to fulfill his plan through the power of his promise. And so, after many more years, when Abraham is even older and Sarah is even older, they eventually have a son, Isaac, when it's seemingly impossible that they would ever have a child. They have this son, Isaac, and Isaac isn't born by human initiative or human power. Isaac is the son of the promise. He is born as the result of a divine promise. So two children, two boys, Ishmael, Isaac, very different. One born according to human initiative and effort, and the other one born as a result of the powerful promise of God. In Hebrews 11 it says, by faith Sarah received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man Abraham, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars in the sky. And Paul takes these two women, Hagar and Sarah, and these two boys, Ishmael and Isaac, and he applies it allegorically. And he says these two women are symbolic of two covenants, an old covenant and a new covenant. Let's start with the old covenant. It says Hagar, she's a slave woman. She represents the old covenant. And central to the old covenant, we're told, is Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai, you'll know that's where Moses gets God's law. And Paul says that Hagar is like the present city of Jerusalem. So the present city of Jerusalem at Paul's time was all about rules and regulations and obedience to the law. And he says that's like Hagar. And Hagar is bringing forth children that are slaves. That's the present city of Jerusalem. Those that are under the law, those who are born by human effort. And he wants these Galatians to see that in turning to the law, they are not going to find freedom, they are going to find slavery. Because that's what Hagar does. She brings forth children for slavery. That's what the law does. We saw that. It enslaves us. It shows us our bondage. And then he turns to Sarah. He says Sarah represents the new covenant. Central to the new covenant, the promises of God. That's at the centre of the new covenant, the promises of God that find their fulfilment in Jesus Christ. We found that those promises were to Abraham and his offspring, and Paul made a big deal that word offspring, that's singular, referring to Jesus. So they centre on Jesus Christ. And Sarah, she represents, where does it say this? The Jerusalem above, verse 26. Sarah, she represents the Jerusalem above, and the Jerusalem above is free. So all of Sarah's children are not slaves, but are free, and they will one day inherit the fullness of that freedom. What we have to see here is that God's great plan doesn't centre on the physical descendants of Abraham, the physical offspring. Not all the physical offspring of Abraham. It centres on the offspring, the seed, Jesus Christ. And all who will come to trust in him. Everyone who comes to faith in Jesus is part of the heavenly Jerusalem. And as we sit here tonight, trusting Jesus, standing on his promises, we are citizens of the heavenly Jerusalem, the heavenly city. Paul quotes from Isaiah there, doesn't he? Verse 27, Isaiah 54, so Isaiah 53, that's that great servant chapter, the suffering servant. He was bruised for our iniquities. That's Isaiah 53. And then in Isaiah 54, verse 1, it says, "Rejoice, O barren one who does not bear, break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labour. For the child of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who has a husband." At that point, Israel are in captivity. It all looks like it's gone pear-shaped. It looks like God's promises are at an end. And Isaiah comes with this message that even though things look barren, you know, the children of the barren one are just going to be far more numerous. And that's exactly what's happened over the last 2,000 years. The number of children who have been born according to the promise has just gone up exponentially. As the gospel has spread, as people have heard the message about Jesus and the freedom that he brings, many people across the world from all different nations have become part of Abraham's family, have become part of the new Jerusalem, the heavenly city. Jews and Gentiles, male and female, all have become one in Jesus Christ. And all of those Old Testament saints who've trusted in the promises of God and lived by faith, and all of those since Jesus come who've trusted in the promised one and lived by faith in him, are all gathered together, a countless number, like the sand of the sea and the stars of the sky. And one day all those people will populate the new heavens and the new earth. That's the glorious, expansive picture that we see in the book of Galatians. But the Galatians here are in danger of turning back to slavery. I think probably these false teachers were using a lot of the Old Testament verses about Abraham to try and convince the Galatians that they had it right. And Paul here is turning this back on them. He reminds them that if they turn back to the law, they are children of Hagar. And he says, you know what it was said about Hagar and Ishmael? Ishmael will have no inheritance in the promise. Ishmael will have no inheritance in the promise. So he says to them, don't go back to the law. You're doing yourself out of an inheritance. Continue trusting Jesus. And as we sit here tonight, we're all children of one of these two women. We're all children of one of these two women. Not literally, obviously, but we all either children of Sarah or children of Hagar. We are all either trusting in our own efforts and our own initiatives to save us, or we have been born again by the powerful promises of God. Not our own initiative, but by his divine act. We all fall into those two groups. And you know where freedom is found? Freedom is found in being born again. In being made alive by the power of God, not by our own effort. So the call for us tonight is not to go looking anywhere else for freedom. Don't go looking to your own efforts. I don't know about you, but for me, living the Christian life, there's a constant temptation to look at how well I'm doing and base my relationship with God upon my estimation of my own success. I don't know whether that changes as you progress in the Christian life, as you get more mature. Maybe some of you will tell me that maybe that gets worse, maybe that gets easier. But I think for all of us, that's a constant danger, that we will look at ourselves, make a judgment about how we're doing, and base our relationship with God upon that. That's exactly what these Galatians are trying to do. And the call for us is to look away from ourselves and trust in Jesus that he has done it. That he is enough. That he has won our freedom. There will always be religious people out there who are trying to encourage us to rely on our own efforts. Trying to tell us that we need to do this or that, and if we just join their club, then we're really in. But that just flies in the face of the gospel. The gospel teaches us that we are righteous, we are accepted by God just by faith in Jesus Christ. Obviously, that has implications for our lives as to how we live. And we'll see those in chapters 5 and 6. But let's get that foundation really clear, that we are accepted simply by faith in Jesus Christ. I'll read chapter 5, verse 1 again. For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. I've often sat in meetings, Christian meetings, where people have stood up and perhaps unwittingly have so preached from the Bible that they've encouraged me to roll up my sleeves and just try harder. Maybe I've misheard them. I don't know, but it's easy in trying to get a response from people to get them to look to their own efforts. And I've found that often in Christian meetings that people haven't pointed me to Jesus, but in trying to get me to change somehow, they have got me to focus upon myself and my own efforts. And that is not the gospel. That is not the gospel. The gospel is about faith in Jesus Christ. And only the gospel that's passed on to us by the apostles will bring freedom. And it's only faith in the promises of God and in the promised one that will bring us freedom. Our own efforts and our own initiatives will only lead us back to slavery. So let's stand firm. Let's stand firm in the gospel, and let's stand firm in our faith in the promises of God. Before we come round the communion table,